Welcome to TrineDay's Roundtable 27. Come with us into JFK's vision of world peace and justice. I am Bruce Torres, moderating. These roundtables explore President Kennedy's peace plan and the economics of Henry George, which create prosperity and economic justice wherever they are applied. As Harry Truman said, the only thing new in the world is the history that you don't know. And as Shakespeare's Hamlet said, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. And as John F. Kennedy said, every man can make a difference, and every man should try. Today, authors Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould will discuss something very important that happened on this date, February 14th, back in the 1970s. Something that changed the course of world history, but most people have never heard of it. Then Earth rights activist Alana Hartsock will tell us how the original Earth Day will be celebrated next month on the spring equinox on March 19th. But first, to tell us more about today's date, February 14th, a man who has published over 180 books over the past 20 years, books that challenge official history. Our host, Chris Milligan.
Thank you, Bruce. And yes, today's February 14th, Valentine's Day. It's my anniversary, 36 years.
Wow.
It's Oregon's birthday, the 33rd state. It was 164. It's 164 years old. And then on February 14th, 1962, JFK had a press conference. And I'm going to read something from there. The question was, Mr. President, a number of your right-wing critics say that your foreign policy is based on a no-win policy in the Cold War. Would you address yourself to this charge? The president. Well, of course, every American, whoever they may be, wants the United States to be secure and at peace, and they want the cause of freedom around the world to prevail. Quite obviously, this is our national objective. What we are anxious to do, of course, is to protect our national security, protect the freedom of countries, permit what Thomas Jefferson called the disease of liberty, to be caught in areas which are now held by communists and some areas where people are imprisoned. We want to do that, of course, without having a nuclear war. Now, if someone thinks we should have a nuclear war in order to win, I can inform them that there will be no winners in the next nuclear war, if there is one, and this country and other countries would suffer very heavy blows. So we have to proceed with responsibility and with care in an age where the human race can obliterate itself. The object of this administration, and I think the object of the country, is to protect our security, keep the peace, protect our vital interests, and make it possible for what we believe to be a system of government which is in accordance with the basic aspirations of people everywhere to ultimately prevail. This is our objective, and this is the one that we shall continue. Thank you. And, also on that date, Jackie Kennedy gave a tour of the White House, which was broadcast on all three networks. And President Kennedy was commented about that. And he said, I've always felt that American history is sometimes a dull subject. There is so much emphasis on dates. But I think that if they come here and see alive this building and in a sense touch the people who have been here, then they will go home more interested, and I think they will become better Americans. And some of them may want to someday live here themselves, which I think would be good. And then with a chuckle, he added, even the girls. Okay, so, President Kennedy was president when I was a youngster. Okay, and it was a very, for the young people of that day, it was very hopeful to see this man there. And because most of our parents had been in World War II, gone through the Depression, and gone through some heavy times, okay? And so we were just, coming out of the 50s, and we had this brilliant president, very, very engaging. And, it was very sad. And he had his world vision of peace. I mean, you can go over his writings and his sayings over and over again, and they're so inspiring. Like he said, all of us breathe the same air. And so I'm so happy that, we get people to spend their time on this roundtable to work towards JFK's world vision of peace. And part of that is engaging ourselves in the world. What we're doing here, one thing we're doing is we're reclaiming, okay, the original Earth Day. Okay, it was started on March 19th. Why was it pushed off into April? Well, it's disorientating. It's disorientating. And for us to actually, reclaim this and celebrate it on the equinox here is very powerful. And, a lot of people, we're going to be doing this in conjunction with the UN. People say, oh, the UN, you're a bunch of globalists, you're bad people. Well, the UN is just a thing, just like anything. And it can be used for good or bad. It's what people do with it. And, we have to talk to each other. We as a sovereign country, we have to talk to other countries. We have to all work together because we only live on one planet, one blue ball going through space. So onwards to a better future. And thank you all very much for your efforts in this effort.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
And now, Paul and Liz, hello, how are you?
Okay. Well, we're going to be giving you a story about Valentine's Day from 1979. And believe it or not, by the time you end up hearing this story, you will understand how it is actually connected to JFK and his peace movement, and ultimately to the economics of peace. So Paul is going to present this to you.
Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. For most of us, St. Valentine's Day will always be associated with the 1929 St. Valentine's Day massacre, when Al Capone's gang gunned down Bugsy Moran's gang in Chicago, full of a Chicago warehouse full of bootleg liquor. Al Capone merged mob violence with romance in 1929, and thanks to Hollywood, Valentine's Day has been that way ever since. But there was another Valentine's Day massacre 50 years later in Kabul, Afghanistan, that most people have never heard of. Everybody knows the assassination of JFK took the United States off a course towards world peace and cooperation. But many people know, how many people know that the assassination of U.S. Ambassador Adolph Dubs on February 14, 1979, ensured that the U.S. would permanently pivot back to the same course that was inaugurated with the murder of JFK. So today I want to talk about that other Valentine's Day massacre as described in our book, Valediction, 3 Nights of Desmond. And to start, I want to take you back 45 years. Few people today realize what the failure of the Vietnam War really meant to the people who made American policy. To quote from author Fred Kaplan's 1983 Wizards of Armageddon, Vietnam brought out the dark side of nearly everyone inside America's national security machine, and it exposed something seamy and disturbing about the very enterprise of the defense intellectuals, otherwise known as the New York intellectuals. It revealed that the concept of force underlying all their formulations and scenarios was an abstraction, practically useless as a guide to action. Nevertheless, by the mid-1970s, the same people who'd created that abstraction were busy reinventing themselves into a neoconservative political force, and in 1976, the year of Jimmy Carter's election, joined forces with old right-wing hawks and defense Democrats to oppose détente and strategic arms limitation by convening an official panel called the Team B. Recommended by Leo Chern, chairman of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and approved by CIA Director George Bush, Team B's stated objective was to determine whether the CIA had underestimated Soviet capabilities, and to no one's surprise, their ideological analysis not only changed the national intelligence estimate around by 180 degrees, but went on to prophesy that the Soviets would soon exploit this American weakness to invade a neighboring country. A veil of intrigue surrounded the creation of Team B from the start. Leo Chern, along with his partner, future CIA Director William Casey, had written the book on militarizing the American economy just before Pearl Harbor in a manual titled Adjusting Your Business to War. John Arthur Paisley, the CIA's liaison charged with reviewing the Team B's conclusion and a Team B critic, disappeared in September 1978 while reviewing the report on a boat in Chesapeake Bay. A body fixed to diving weights and shot in the head execution style was found 2 days later that failed on numerous accounts to match his description, and yet Paisley's death was ruled a suicide and the body cremated. A campaign waged by Team B supporters would claim the discrepancies proved Paisley was a KGB mole and that the real Paisley had been whisked away behind the Iron Curtain. But in the end, no proof of KGB hijinks ever emerged. In the final analysis, Team B's real objective was to avoid American system of checks and balances and politicized intelligence by delivering the levers of power to followers of Leo Strauss and turn reality into whatever they wanted it to be. As described by Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan decades later, the neoconservative agenda of Team B was to scare the government into establishing a full mobilization and endless war against Russia, and in this, they ultimately succeeded. Following the election of Jimmy Carter in 1976, this new neoconservative alliance, led by Richard Pipes, Paul Wolfowitz, Paul Nitze, and Senator Henry Scoop Jackson of Washington, continued to lobby against SALT and détente and found a powerful ally in President Carter's national security advisor, the well-known Russophobe Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski had helped elevate Carter to the presidency as a member of the Trilateral Commission, a Rockefeller-funded group whose goal was to restore U.S. hegemony after the Vietnam War. In return, Carter appointed him to the exclusive National Security Advisor post, which Carter had elevated to cabinet level, and which Brzezinski then reorganized to assume control over CIA covert action and seize power from Secretary of State Cyrus Vance. In the words of one boastful neoconservative, it was a bureaucratic first strike, with Carter doing precisely what he promised not to do. According to former Secretary of Defense and CIA Director Robert Gates, despite President Carter's campaign promises to establish better relations with the Soviet Union, upon coming into office in January 1977, Brzezinski immediately began destabilizing pro-Soviet regimes and looking for a place to trap the Soviets. Then, in an effort to fulfill Team B's prophecy, he activated covert action inside Soviet territory bordering Afghanistan, hoping to provoke a response. By April of 1978, Brzezinski's efforts were bearing fruit when a radical Marxist group led by the US-educated Hafizullah Amin seized power in a bloody coup in Kabul. And by the time the new American ambassador to Afghanistan, Adolph Dubs, arrived that May, the Afghan trap was ready to be sprung. A proponent of détente and opponent of Brzezinski's anti-Soviet plots, Dubs was a Soviet expert who had served as the U.S. ambassador in Moscow during the Cuban Missile Crisis and as a chargé d'affaires in 1973-74. His posting to Kabul came at a critical tipping point in the U.S.-Soviet relations. According to former Washington Post reporter Selig Harrison, Dubs' assignment was to coordinate a multinational and UN effort to control narcotics production and trafficking in Afghanistan, establish a close personal relationship with Amin, and detach him from the Soviet Union. But he knew dealing with Amin, a main organizer of the coup who'd received a master's at Columbia and studied at the University of Wisconsin, would be tricky. Following official State Department policy, put Dubs in direct conflict with Brzezinski and Team B, as well as a covert entity known as the Safari Club, which was standing in secretly for the CIA. According to Peter Dale Scott, the Safari Club was an off-the-books alliance between national intelligence agencies that wished to compensate for the CIA's retrenchment in the wake of President Carter's election and Senator Church's post-Watergate reforms, and focused on fighting communism. Dubs' arrival on the scene was intended to bring Afghanistan's new government closer to the US while keeping the Soviets out. But with the Safari Club working against him, the chances were close to zero he could succeed. Destabilizing Afghanistan satisfied a long list of interlocking agendas, and it would soon become obvious that Dubs would have no support from the Russophobe Brzezinski. First and foremost, Afghanistan's strategic position was crucial to the designs of an emerging globalist cabal, looking to migrate the booming drug trade from Southeast Asia to the opium-growing northwest frontier provinces of Pakistan, where a friendly government could protect it. To the Saudis, it provided the opportunity to spread its radical Wahhabist doctrine to Central Asia's Muslim population, while gaining control over oil pipeline routes to Europe. And to the Americans, it was the ideal location to inflict a humiliating and low-cost revenge on the Soviet Union by giving them their own Vietnam. The CIA had set the stage for conflict in 1977 with an absurdly fabricated report that Soviets would soon run out of oil, putting them desperately in need of new outside sources. This disinformation would soon find its way into Carter administration efforts to blame the Soviets for the coup in Afghanistan, as Brzezinski and the CIA warned of a Soviet master plan to take over the oil fields of the Middle East, using Afghanistan as a stepping stone. Adding to those dangers was an outright civil war over foreign policy inside the White House, which pitted Brzezinski against Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, whose State Department intelligence unit found no evidence of Soviet complicity in the 1978 Marxist coup and dismissed Brzezinski's claim as a Cold War fantasy. But that fantasy was becoming real for both Moscow and the American ambassador Adolph Dubs, as he struggled to balance his influence with the Soviets, who were becoming convinced Amin was on the CIA's payroll. To make things worse, by that fall, as the uprising in the country grew, Amin wrestled for power inside his own party and proceeded to imprison and execute many of his political rivals. Rumors spread that he was seeking an agreement with the CIA's favorite, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a fellow member of the Ghilzai clan who'd been trying to overthrow the Afghan royal family for more than a century. Nevertheless, Dubs continued to press on secretly, meeting with Amin 14 times over the next few months, wanting to keep a back door open to Afghan and American influence while not triggering Soviet countermeasures. Dubs knew that Brzezinski's covert action was intended to lure a Soviet response. He'd even asked the State Department for an analysis of a possible Soviet invasion before leaving Washington. But when Dubs complained about it, Brzezinski blocked the State Department from doing anything about it and sent Thomas P. Thornton from the National Security Council to tell Dubs to knock it off. By February of 1979, Dubs was an ambassador out ahead of a State Department policy that was being burned to the ground. And then on the morning of February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, a kidnapper posing as a police officer stopped Dubs's armored Oldsmobile on the way to the U.S. Embassy and got the ambassador to open the door. Followed by 3 additional kidnappers, they demanded to be driven to the Cabell Hotel in the center of town and took the ambassador to room 117. Nothing about the abduction made sense. The hotel was the worst place for the kidnappers to have chosen. The hotel was crowded and filled with Afghan, Soviet, and Iraqi security accompanying a high-level diplomatic mission. The room 117 was indefensible from the street outside, and the door to the room was locked. The original policeman who'd stopped the car disappeared into the crowd the minute they'd entered the lobby, and the kidnapper sent downstairs to get the key was immediately apprehended. Bruce Flatton, the embassy's first secretary, returned to the hotel using Dubs's armored Oldsmobile and noticed the U.S. flag had been removed from the car's right front fender, and its American eagle top was missing. Was this a signal? Simultaneous to these events in Kabul, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Carter and Vance were out of town on a diplomatic mission to Mexico and caught off guard. Undersecretary of State Warren Christopher took charge of the White House but sent mixed signals about what to do to the embassy in Kabul. With the hotel swarming in security, Flatton informed the Afghan police that the room where Dubs was being held should not be stormed under any circumstances, and was given assurances by the Russians that it wouldn't be. But as the morning wore on, the Afghans began to take action. Back at the embassy, the deputy U.S. chief of mission was told by the State Department to negotiate with the kidnappers and not do anything to endanger the ambassador, but failed to reach Amin by phone. Hours passed. Rumors abounded as numerous other members of the embassy staff trickled into the hotel. CIA officer Warren Marek and Drug Enforcement Agency attaché Harold Doug Wankel arrived around noon. Wankel had a close working relationship with Police Superintendent Syed Tarun from an ongoing DEA-funded drug enforcement program. Superintendent Tarun's police were known to be corrupt and violent. Wankel had just met with him on January 17th to co-sign a payment of 11,700 Afghanis to an Afghan drug informant. Flatten met with a Russian security officer and told him he wanted to talk to the ambassador. Minutes later, he was asked to come upstairs, where he knelt at the keyhole and conversed with Dubs about the situation until the police informed him to tell your ambassador that exactly 10 minutes from now, he is to fall to the floor. Flatten retreated to the foyer at the top of the stairs, where he saw Police Chief Mohammed Lal preparing an assault team. Lal was known to be a dangerous psychopath, and Flatten realized he'd taken control of the operation. Flatten learned from the Soviet advisor for the first time that the Afghan police are working under a deadline imposed by the kidnappers. The U.S. security officer transmitted over his radio that the Afghans were now ready acting under somebody else's orders, but he doesn't know who. Wankel, Marek, and 2 other embassy staff carry a stretcher upstairs to the foyer. A man who is assumed to be a KGB agent provides a weapon to a member of the Afghan assault team. The Soviet advisors position the Afghan snipers across the street. Afghan commandos move into position near the door. Flatten observes there are no Soviets present or involved in the assault team. At 12:45, a presumed Soviet advisor goes to the window and signals 5 minutes to the Afghan police snipers on the balcony. Then at exactly 12:50, a gunshot rings out inside the room. Single gunshot is followed by heavy gunfire in the corridor, inside the room, and from the balcony across the street. Smoke and flying debris fill the hallway for what seems a full minute, until the Soviet advisor reappears at the window and waves his arms. Flatten heads for the splintered door, but is held back by Police Chief Lal, who enters the room ahead of him. He hears 4 more loud bursts inside the room, then silence. Wankel, Marek, and the 2 embassy staffers rush to the room with a stretcher as Flatten peers inside. He sees the ambassador slumped dead in a chair by the wall with multiple wounds to his head and body. His 2 kidnappers sprawled nearby. The floor is covered in water from radiators shot up in the barrage. Flatten observes that half of the ambassador's clothing is wet, as if he'd been lying on the floor, and somebody propped him up in the chair. But was he killed from the bank balcony or by someone in the room? The conflicting interpretations of how Adolf Dubs dies reveals the stark divisions inside the Carter administration. Flatten is a State Department diplomat tasked with maintaining American policy. Wankel and Marek are DEA CIA policemen with a Team B agenda who want to blame the Soviets before the facts are even known. The DEA-CIA connection itself is a marriage intended to provide a law enforcement cover for CIA covert action and political assassination. Wankel's background is Detroit police street thug narcotics, paying off informants, dealers, pimps, and prostitutes. Marek is covert agent provocateur, specializing in propaganda and political subversion. In their minds, the KGB is guilty, whether they like it or not. Flatten stood outside the door as the 2 dead kidnappers are dropped at his feet, while the 3rd is wrestled down the stairs and out the door, very much alive. Flatten never sees the kidnappers gone missing until later that night, when the police display 4 dead bodies and claim he's one of them. As the ambassador's body is driven away, Wankel, Marek, and a 3rd embassy staffer return to the scene of the crime and discover the room has been stripped of evidence. Upon inspection, Wankel maintains that Dubs was killed immediately by Soviet-directed gunfire from the bank balcony across the street and died slumped in his chair. But Flatten's observation that 1/2 of Dubs's body was wet as though he'd been lying on the floor, contradicts that. Wankel's opinion implicates the Soviets. Flatten's implicates the Afghan police. Only 30 seconds elapsed between the second shootout when the Americans got into the room, so the evidence points to Police Chief Mohammed Lal. A pattern emerges. Unnamed Americans claimed the Soviets wanted Dubs out of the way so they could set up for an invasion, but the rules of the game make ambassadors virtually untouchable. There was no upside to killing one and a big downside, and there's plenty of evidence to show the Soviets didn't want to invade. Others claimed the Soviets were afraid that Dubs would win Hafizullah Amin over to their control. But Hafizullah Amin was never under Soviet control, and Dubs spent most of his final days trying to calm Amin down. But with Brzezinski controlling the narrative, things occurred that never should have been allowed to happen. The Dubs killing reveals the same slanted presentations as JFK, and with the same results. JFK's assassination ended the original process of compromise and cooperation underway with the Soviet Union following the Cuban Missile Crisis, until the reality of Vietnam could no longer be denied and President Johnson was forced to initiate détente. President Carter was elected to further that détente, but with the assassination of Ambassador Adolph Dubs on February 14, 1979, it instead laid the foundation for a permanent state of war that continues to this day. Thank you.
And now we want to just make the connection clear about where we are now with JFK's peace plan that we are now trying to activate, and the economics of peace that has to be in place for that to happen.
Thank you, Paul and Liz. And now, Earth rights activist, Alana Hartsock.
Thank you. Happy to be with everyone today. Happy Day of Love and Peace and Justice, not totally brought forth for the United States. That's what we're all about. Connecting the dots from the very personal story that Paul and Liz experienced about the assassination of Dubs to really underlying the several high-profile and very sad assassinations that have happened in the United States is an extremely nefarious political economy. Our democracy was not founded upon economic democracy. We brought over the economic system from the old country where people were being impoverished and exploited and fled to the new country. As long as there was available land, there could grow a strong middle class, which is what happened. But you all know that wealth inequality is growing and the middle class is collapsing. So there are important dots that we're connecting here today. And I believe that as more and more of us get these dots really clearly connected, we're going to have this eureka ha-ha experience that many of you on the call, if not all of you, have already had. And then we'll be led to very clear and strong action together in a local to global worldwide movement for peace and justice. So the equinox, it was the original Earth Day, the spring equinox in March, founded by John McConnell, proclaimed by the city of San Francisco, and brought forth every year except during the COVID years for 50 or so years by the ringing of the peace bell, which is within the United Nations, and small talks and music and poetry, connected with people around the world ringing their own bells for peace at the time of equinox. The Earth Society Foundation was largely organizer of this. John founded that with Margaret Mead. However, the economics of peace was not brought forward to any extent in all the years. John was just doing so many visionary and wonderful things, but I want to read a little bit of what is written about John McConnell's economics of peace. And this is from Robert Weir's biography of John McConnell called Peace, Justice, Care of Earth, the Vision of John McConnell. I'd highly recommend you all to get this book. It's really still so relevant today in terms of a pathway forward. So John wrote a speech that he gave at the United Nations Church Center, actually 50 years ago, 1974, and it was titled Earth's Resurrection. And he outlined 3 global objectives in the area of ecology, justice, and love. Justice, he said, involved equal individual rights to the use of earth and its raw materials, and equal responsibility for the care and preservation of Earth's bounty. John found that most people easily understood his ideas for ecology and care of Earth, but his message regarding justice was harder to comprehend. This was caused, at least in part, by adherence to the Code of Hammurabi, written 18 centuries before the birth of Christ, which defined justice as an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In contrast, John described that as legalized revenge. Now that's important because Paul and Liz frequently talk about the need to end the revenge cycle. What is happening? So many wars. We're still seeing these revenge cycles. We're otherizing the enemy and saying that they did something terribly wrong and we have to pay them back. When John McConnell spoke of justice, he meant economic justice, which he defined as equal sharing in all the world's natural resources. In his Planetary Inheritance Declaration, he wrote, "Among the equal rights of men is the equal right to an equal share in nature's bounty, a right of each to his planetary inheritance, share of land, water, minerals, or an appropriate equivalent in food, housing, or other benefits." It says no one can, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity or any person's posterity of the right to his portion of earth. To a large extent, John drew his inspiration from American political economist and social reformer Henry George, who was as well known then as his contemporaries, Thomas Edison and Mark Twain, when he was writing at the end of the 1800s, and his influential book, Progress and Poverty, 1879, became a worldwide best-selling book. Everyone was reading and discussing Progress and Poverty, and it launched a major movement, which was later crushed. We won't go into that corruption story, but that's what happened. Henry George espoused that land is a free gift of nature, that all people have an equal right to use the land, and it was unfair for a few to acquire great wealth by holding land that increased in value merely due to the passage of time. George prescribed that the unearned income from the property's value should be the sole source of all taxation. So his idea was to remove taxes from production, wages, labor, and shift it onto this unearned income, which we often call the land rent or the economic rent. Now, this is what we're bringing forward for our March Equinox Earth Day celebrations, events, and the one we've organized in New York at the Henry George School that day. Anybody near New York is welcome to come to that. I hope you do, but we really are encouraging you to endorse this Earth Day, the events, and most important that you organize something to have a discussion about Earth rights. If it's a small group of friends that come together for a meal and talk about intentionally this theme of the rights to the earth of all human beings and how we can secure that right. And then from that, you can begin to launch real implementation projects. Out there, no one's going to do this for us. We're getting our analysis very, very clear about the economics of war and how we shifted to an economics of peace. But very few who are very clear in their understanding of what's going on in the world geopolitically have any clear solutions. You're still hearing left socialism, this government has to intervene, but the government's pretty corrupt. We can't see it coming from our federal government. Or the right, just remove taxes and everything will be okay. The market will work. This is a very, very clear third way outside of the right-left box is people like us working together coherently, synergistically can bring this about. Now, I want to go through just a few of the what I think are really key articles that I've come across lately, and I put some of the links in the chat already. They're in the chat. You can copy and paste, or we'll show you how to save chats. But I want you also to take down, please, this email address is very simple. It's equinoxearthday@gmail.com. Please write it down. Please, that goes into an inbox that I have. I want to send you the documents we have for Equinox Earth Day, where you can sign up for an event, where you can endorse, and various other follow-throughs. This is a real action agenda. I'll send those to you and we'll be linked up for the Earth Day. This is going to be a steady pulse, a steady beat throughout the year. A couple of the documents are also on the website of the International Union for Land Value Taxation. It would be www.viu. And we have Wendy Rockwell here's with us, and Wendy's in Costa Rica. University of Peace is in Costa Rica, and Wendy is the president of the International Union for Land Value Taxation. We have a number of our board members from around the world, and I think pretty much every continent now, who are planning Earth Day events for March. And maybe I could send that detail out to you, those of you who connect with me by equinoxearthday@gmail.com. Now, this is from Speak Truth to Power by John and Nisha Whitehead. The Global Deep State, a fascist world order funded by the American taxpayer. This is what is key here. This is what other peace and justice people, they're just saying, oh, the government should take the money out of the military and use good things about it. It's not going to happen. We've got to go a lot deeper. We got to take this responsibility that we're funding the horrors that we're seeing. We are funding the killings. We have to say no, not in our name and not with our tax dollars. It's going to take a real strong movement in solidarity, say no, but we know how to shift. We can work locally to shift power away from the federal government and place it in our localities and quit sending all this money to a thoroughly corrupted federal government. And let's see, it was Marty. You mentioned you worked with Dennis Kucinich. And so some of us are aware of the strong work for U.S. Department of Peace, Congressman Dennis Kucinich, how he was the strongest voice for peace in Congress, how they gerrymandered him out of his office so that he could not be reelected. Thank God they haven't assassinated him, but they politically assassinated him. So from the Whiteheads again, the United States have 5% of the world's population, and yet we have 50% of the world's total military expenditure. The Pentagon spends more on war than all 50 states combined spend on health, education, welfare, and safety. There's a good reason why bloated, corrupt, and inefficient are among the words most commonly applied to the federal government. Driven by a greedy defense sector, the American homeland has been transformed. Now, the homeland, they're saying, has been transformed into a battlefield with militarized police and weapons better suited to a war zone. Now, here's a good one. Israel, one of America's closest international allies and recipient of more than $3 billion in U.S. foreign military aid, has been at the forefront of a little publicized exchange program aimed at training American police to act as occupying forces in their communities. As The Intercept sums up, American police are essentially taking lessons from agencies that enforce military rule rather than civil law. Okay, so the police force is being trained to treat us like we're combatants, like we're conspiring against the government, so that whenever there's protests, they can use very brutal methods often to suppress protests. Now, there's some important articles, and that's again in the chat. One is Ukraine. What is the end game? And he says the privatization of an entire country. U.S. has conducted numerous wars since what's euphemistically called the post-war era. Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Afghanistan, which we heard about today, Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and now Palestine and Ukraine. The unspoken objective is not to win the war, but is to engineer the destruction of entire countries, to create political and social chaos, with a view to ultimately picking up the pieces and taking control of the national economies of sovereign nation states. The hegemonic agenda is conducted through regime change, color revolutions, demise and criminalization of state apparatus of these countries, coupled with so-called strong economic medicine and the imposition of a soaring dollar-denominated debt. Now, another one just came out from Jeremy Kuzmarov. Disaster capitalists are ready to descend on Ukraine. So I'll read a little bit of this, and then we're going to go into how we can work solutions. So it goes about DuPont, Monsanto, these corporations who've investing heavily in Ukrainian agriculture. They purchased more than 17 million hectares of Ukraine's arable land. That's more than all the arable land that exists in Italy, already in control of US corporations. The main shareholders are Wall Street investment firms, Vanguard Group, BlackRock, Blackstone. They're also major investors and share owners in Raytheon, major military contractor. Boeing and Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and Lockheed Martin have done brisk business contributing to the destruction of Ukraine. The International Monetary Fund made the lifting of a moratorium on the sale of land to foreign companies a condition for the loan package to Ukraine. A poll found that 81% of Ukrainians were against the sale of land to foreigners and lifting of the moratorium against selling land to foreigners, while only 13% were in favor of it. Geopolitical analyst Drago Bostic wrote that the Ukrainian people have not only been quite literally robbed of the lands their ancestors gave their lives for, they are also effectively dying in battle to make sure that this continues. We have to keep in mind that this external colonialism by the corporate rule elites, grabbing land, grabbing resources, putting these people in deep debt, is also happening to us in the United States. If you look at the homelessness situation, at the wealth inequality, and at the extreme wealth inequality, homelessness, and what's happening in our inner cities, how many of you have homeless people in their cities and towns? Can you raise your hand? Homeless people where you live. Some of you are not able to see you raise your hands, but I think most everybody else raised their hands. Okay, it's increasing, isn't it? Are the young people you know having trouble finding affordable housing? Yes, it's a crisis. And underlying this is the land problem. We're treating Mother Earth as a market commodity for buying, selling, and speculation. Indigenous people couldn't even imagine doing this. Both Native Americans and African indigenous consider it's a crime to buy and sell the land. It was not even thought of, as were the indigenous people of the Middle East. The Palestinian people did not have land title. It was the shrewd Arabs, when the Zionists came with money to buy land in Palestine, the shrewd Arabs said, oh, they faked the title. Here's the title, I own this land. So the Zionists could buy land. They could say, I have the title. They go to the Bedouins and the Palestinian indigenous people and say, this is my land now. Here's the title. I bought it. You get off the land. So for the Western system, buying land was legitimate, but it legitimizes conquest and plunder and land grabbing of all the other people. But right now, we just use our military, as we see elsewhere in Ukraine, about the corporations taking over the land, and certainly just a total utter destruction that we see in Gaza. So,
Alana.
yeah, I'm almost done.
Okie dokie.
I'm about 1 minute done. The last link is to a video called Internal Colonialism, Land Maps, and Land Value Tax. With all the censorship that we are seeing and experiencing in, we have an Achilles heel to the censorship. We can use information technology to understand exactly who owns what land where in our towns and cities. And I want to go into this more deeply another time with a PowerPoint to look at these land value maps, but you will see them in this video that's linked to in the chat. We can see the internal colonialism where our poorest areas, the land is owned by the few wealthy people, and the rents are pouring out of the poor areas of our cities and into the pockets of the few. This is what we call internal colonialism. And by seeing it under the noses where we live, and by instituting a tax reform, which is not that difficult to do, and we can work with you to do it, by bringing in a land value tax system, a property tax, we can start addressing the internal colonialism and therefore play a role in addressing the foreign policy that is now killing people around the world of the United States. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Alana. From the top, Chris Milligan described JFK's peace desires, intents, and efforts, and read from one of Kennedy's magnificent 64 different press conferences, which every student of America or lover of liberty ought to study all of Kennedy's press conferences. So that's a huge topic. I invite everyone to comment on, ask questions on, as well as the second one, the astounding history Paul and Liz brought to us and the account of what happened in Afghanistan in 1979, because it's crucial to the awful military empire that the United States is. And the third huge thing to ask questions, and we'll have robust discussions about, is the most important history and urgent need to accomplish so much of what Alana Hartsock described. So who's got the next question or comment?
Corruption.
Talk about corruption, Chris Milligan.
Well, you know, our government, yes, is corrupt. Okay. Who corrupted it? Okay. Money interest corrupted it. Industrialists. I've been talking a lot myself about the secret societal system, and I found that to be the main corrupting influence. My father was branch chief, head of all of East Asia Analysis Office for the CIA, and he told me, he says, Vietnam War is about drugs. There's these secret societies behind it. Okay, and the drug trade is a very corrupting trade because people are selling plants and for more than gold. They're selling, they're creating these chemical things. I mean, we have just incredible drugs that are being put on the street, and they create huge amounts of money, and these huge amounts of money allow amazing corruption. So yes, our federal government is very corrupt, but again, our federal government is just a thing like any other thing. We can uncorrupt it. Okay. How do we do that? We do that by voting in good, honest people. Okay. And like a lot of people, state too, that, it starts locally. Okay. And if you have the time, work with your local government, because I mean, if I followed local government, I've gone to city council meetings, gone to county meetings, and a lot of times you have very few people there. Okay. And so our government is a government of and by and for the people. Okay. So to make it work, the people have to work in it. The people can't just say, oh, government, give me this, government, give me this, government, do that. Okay. So the way to fix our corrupted federal government is to change it. Part of changing that government is understanding that corruption, where it came from, okay, and understanding the Georgist, what he developed in the late 1800s, this land tax. People need to understand how that can work. And as Alana has shown, in Harrisburg, they got rid of a terrible situation. So we can do it, but we have to do it.
I would refer people to the following YouTube channel, which has our 26 previous roundtables on it on YouTube. The channel is Valediction Vision, and the previous one, number 26, is a great teaching on the economics of Henry George and how that, to get anyone quickly up to speed, in addition to viu.org, which is in the chat, the organization Alana talked about. I do invite Paul and Liz to comment about how the assassination of U.S. Ambassador Dubs changed the course of world history.
Well, I was just thinking that, Bruce. Thank you
I'm-
for giving me
I'm
the
glad you were.
opportunity. Well, I think our point, is to try to get people to connect back, in this sense, to a moment in history where, just like with JFK, there was a pivot to go in a certain direction, a potentiality, okay? And what we realized about JFK was that although the pivot definitely was altered when he was assassinated, by the end of the Vietnam War, the pivot had returned again, okay? But we didn't know what happened. We didn't, we knew we were on the course, but why did it go away? And that was what was so amazing to understand, that the moment did live in this history about Afghanistan and about Adolf Dubs and what he was trying to do. He was like a miniature in his own way of what JFK was doing, and he was causing the same problem for those interests that Chris is talking about, powerful interests. Sometimes they're recognized, sometimes they're not, but they clearly recognize individuals who become obstructive. And part of the reason we went into so much detail about the assassination was to give you the idea of imagining if you had that bird's eye view of what happened to JFK, meaning the politics of the actual people. I mean, that's why this assassination is so incredible, because it's miniature. And you can really see the way that Brzezinski was literally given the power to use the moment. And we're not saying, by the way, that we think that Brzezinski may have participated in any way in the assassination. What we're saying is that the interest and the swirling world around it provided it. And I think we have to begin to see that in the JFK assassination. And there is one thing that also is oftentimes not talked about very much, and that was the privatization of intelligence. And that's where the Safari Club comes in. And that aspect is so impossible to track. So that becomes, one of the easiest ways to make it impossible for the average person to ever get to that aha moment that we'd all like to, whether it's with JFK or whether it's with Adolf Dubs. But what the important thing to remember is we still have his vision. We still have both of their visions to see a more peaceful world. And we have the power to actually begin to take it seriously to make it happen finally.
And among, Paul, would you add to that?
I would just say that, the Dubs assassination is a picture perfect example. It's a prototype of how to remove power from an elected government and put it in the hands of privatized interests. And because it happened amazingly effectively. The Saudis wanted, there were, as I mentioned, only three of the reasons why everyone wanted this to happen. The Saudis were looking to get influence inside the American government. They wanted to compete with the Israelis. The French had done a good amount of research about the moving the drug trade from Southeast Asia, following the protection by the American military during the war, in the cover of the American military. They moved it to Pakistan, to the Northwest Frontier provinces, and they were more than willing to accept it. And they created a trucking company for the drugs. The Pakistani military did, and they did all kinds of things that were, millions and millions of tons of this stuff was just moved out of that area. And it was just an absolute, corruption of the entire process of government. And so, it's just, as I said, it's a case study in how to overthrow legitimate government and in corruption.
Paul, the drugs you just described being moved from that region, did that follow, and was that under a Western or American military buildup in the 80s after Dubs' assassination, or were you alluding to things in the 70s?
Well, there were things that happened during the 70s, but it also went in through the 1980s. The Iran-Contra affair is connected to it. Supplying the Contras in South America is connected to it. The Bank of Commerce and Credit International is connected to it. That was And, as Jack Bloom put it in an interview
Yeah.
many years ago, he said, everybody used the Bank of Credit and Commerce International.
Okay.
The Americans used it.
Yeah.
The process that occurred ironically, because of the church committee hearings, in which were intended to get to the bottom of some of the things that were going on in secret with
Yeah.
the CIA, and not just the CIA, but other intelligence agencies as well.
Each individual watching this, hearing this, or challenged by this has to do the research till they're convinced, and then they can do things. It's only when we're convinced that we'll actually take any actions to say, hey, I want a peaceful world. Hey, I want an economy of peace. I want to know what these Henry George principles are. Liz Gould.
Thank you, Bruce. Perfect setup, because my whole point is to really help people understand that the point about wanting peace is obvious to almost anybody, and it's very easy to convince somebody to want peace. And it's very difficult to explain to somebody why it's so difficult to acquire. And that's the point we're trying to make about the process we're in. We have to begin to actually understand at a practical level how this actual corruption works. As I would want to add one thing. These efforts have been put out over and over and over again. And the question a lot of people have is, if so much effort has been put into trying to create peace, and so many people have tried for so long, we have to ask ourselves, what is taking it away? That's my point about understanding the reality of how the system works and that's the point about, I think that's what Paul was laying out in the way in which the entire corruption of the Carter administration happened. Now, we happen to know firsthand, there are an awful lot of people who don't want to believe that President Carter was, his administration was corrupted. They want to believe that still to this day, that he was the best president that we ever had, short of Kennedy, maybe. And so there are difficulties in, that in itself becomes part of the difficulty. And then we have to take a big gulp and say, okay, we ought to grow up kind of quickly at this point, in order to get to the real hard work of really, I think that's the beauty of the George's information, that you can give people any number of ways to enter into an active moment with this, which includes, of course, building the peace and building the economy of peace. And we know that without the building of the economy of peace, the peace can't last. So we understand that, but not everybody's going to do the economy thing.
Yeah.
Chris had mentioned about voting. Well, he mentioned Harrisburg's success with just a small shift to their property tax, how the benefits it had. Our third city, largest in Pennsylvania, Allentown, the people understood enough how this worked that they voted in a land value tax system. And then I wanted to say, maybe you didn't know, I wrote this book, The Earth Belongs to Everyone. It won a Radical Middle Book Award. I'll send it to anybody at cost plus shipping. Just be in touch with me about it. Okay.
When did Allentown adopt those policies?
I want to say around 1996.
Just curious. Thank you, Dean and Ruth. Whose yellow hand is that?
Mine. I love all this information, and so I attempt to talk to people, and I keep bumping into the tsunami of propaganda that's coming out of the media, and the division, the divisiveness that is being made about Trump, and it's like all of a sudden, if I say anything that has a slightly, more radical thing, I'm being accused of being a Trumpite, a MAGA, and it's like people are rabid. It's and so I'm going to just throw that out because I don't know what to do about it. I don't, and I've kind of shut my mouth up.
Yeah, I have definitely an opinion. I think the only thing you can do when you hit that kind of response is listen. I think that's, people, you know, whenever you're faced with anything like that, any one of these hot button issues that really turns people against one another, you know, it really, because that's our whole point about, we want to get to this, the point where we can agree on something, okay? And we have to leave our differences, you know, out there. There's got to be a people unifying moment here, that the things that we care about and really want, and all those other differences for now. And that's our point about, you know, focusing on the economy of peace and the actual ability to build the peace.
And Chris described something that really, to me, the more I think about it, is just the core of it. Go to your local, you know, government meeting and see how many show up and see how few are there.
They're making it easier now too. I mean, a lot of times these meetings now are on Zoom. Okay. And so, because really we need to participate more in our own governance rather than just complain about it.
Yeah, rather than just post on Facebook about it, which I love to do.
I would say to Ruth and others, find in the conversation a common concern. Anybody you talk to has some concerns about some social problem, and find a wedge and connect the dots into, maybe it's homelessness, maybe it's high housing costs, job stress, points to exploitation of labor. Find what the other person's interested in, and help them connect the dots. Maybe we should have little practice conversations in the roundtable sometimes, and really share how we're having effective or need to have more effective conversations.
I think that's a great idea, because I love these ideas, and I keep running up against the wall when I try to talk to people. And, you know, we had a friend here who was a friend of Dean's, who was also a Yaley, and we brought up, you know, talking about all this information, and he went, blah, 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 blah. And it was disappointing, because it's like, how do I enter this into somebody whose mindset is not wanting to say yes, and has a lot of judgment about it.
I would like to add to what Alana said and what you're saying, Ruth. That's our whole point about focusing on something incredibly practical that everyone can agree on. And I think this information about the land value tax is a critical one to get people into a conversation about. You know, to help people understand, to get that information. That's, you know, that's the basic ability that it's a common ground that we all feel. You say to somebody in a conversation, do you think you're overtaxed? You know, and then you can explain to people there's a way to tax things that would eliminate most of the taxes that are a burden to you. Most average people are going to do much better with the land value tax, you know, than they are right now. So I think that would be the key whenever you get into these areas, and you know, many areas that have been politicized. They have been politicized to the point where, you know, they've been turned into, you know, something, you know, that, I mean, we've all lived, look, how many generations have all of us lived with the abortion issue being this hot button issue, which it still is. It's like it never settled. It's never settled. So that's why I
Powers that be don't really care about abortion. What they use it as a bullet, you know,
yes,
into
exactly.
our society's stomach. You
Exactly.
know,
It's polarized.
right,
Right.
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 Chris, that's exactly that energy that I feel like I keep bumping into, is the way that people are being polarized, and they're very, very agitated, and they're very reactive. And I hear what you're saying, Liz, and I feel like I need to understand how to navigate in you know, practice way about how to get this information under the, you know, under somebody's reactivity.
I'm gonna suggest, because it works for me, is to spend 80% of my time just working on my feeling and energetic vibrations and my intention for how I want to feel, because I am persuaded that invisibly, spiritually, and eternally, we are one and we affect each other. And if 90% of success is just showing up, like Woody Allen said, maybe 90% of success in these transformations is be the change you want to see in the world. It sounds like I'm mocking it, but I'm not.
Yeah,
I'm not. I
really.
mean everything I just said sincerely.
Well, I'd like to read something from a speech that JFK made before his election. And this was in September of 1960. And he says, our responsibility is not discharged by an announcement of virtuous ends. Our responsibility is to achieve these objectives with social invention, with political skill, and executive vigor. I believe for these reasons that liberalism is our best and our only hope in the world today. For the liberal society is a free society, and it is at the same time, and for that reason, a strong society. Its strength is drawn from the will of free people committed to great ends and peacefully striving to meet them. Only liberalism, in short, can repair our national power, restore our national purpose, and liberate our national energies. He continues, our liberalism has its roots in our diverse origins. Most of us are descended from that segment of the American population which was once called an immigrant minority. Today, along with our children and grandchildren, we do not feel minor. We feel proud of our origins, and we are not second to any group in our sense of national purpose. And we have people now that are trying to say that, all immigrants are bad and they're going to poison our blood. Well, we're the most multi-ethnic, multi-diverse country ever in the world. And that's one of our strengths. It is not a weakness.
Quanta Dawn Light raised a hand. Speak to us.
Well, thank you very much. I've been working through Rotary, mentoring young people in high school, and we had this speech of actually a peace speech when he gave to the American university. But thank you for this reference. I just found out, and I'm going to read that. I do think that there are a lot of efforts that is not being promoted by media, like the what is it called, Braver Angels, and they are trying to bring, the factions that are sort of kind of at odds with one another together and have a civil conversation about it.
Yeah.
I think we just have to find a way to listen to one another. And because issues that are personal in nature, like abortion, and there are others, are being actually used to divide us.
Right.
I think government has nothing to do with a personal decision of a family or a woman. They just use that, I think, to divide us, and other things as well. But they don't really allow us to talk about economic decisions that they make that impact the poverty and living wages and things that really unite people, because everyone is affected by that. So I encourage you to explore organizations that are trying to bring people together, because there are people out there that think that this is crazy, that we are at each other's throat for nonsense.
No.
I wanted to ask you a question, if I could. We've been talking a lot about the ability for people to understand how much they can empower themselves by using the economics of justice as a way to get into their local communities, as a way to broaden the ability to do just what you're saying. So I wanted to make sure if we can help you get this information into the hands of the people that you're working with, but what we need your guidance to do that. Because what we've discovered is that people need an entry level to get an understanding of the foundation of the Georgist economics before they can, as Alana said, the light bulb goes off in their head. And that would be really fantastic to be able to, get an
Well,
view on that.
That sounds great. I think I've seen you before in other forums as well. What I would like is, let me put my email here. And because I am trying to create an alliance, like a chapter in North Carolina, in Charlotte. I live in Charlotte. It's a very large city. And we just had an organizational meeting. I would like to invite you and maybe give a talk to, and I'm also Rotarian
Okay.
and in the DEI and peace committees and this and that. We need voices like you to be heard, in many, many circles. And so I do very much appreciate it.
Right. Well, and not
And
only
let me leave my email and my WhatsApp here.
okay.
You put it in the chat.
May I ask
I am.
Quanta, could you
Yes.
please just describe what braver angels, and you mentioned it, but I don't really, couldn't quite grab it. Could you be more clear about what that is?
Okay. Braver Angels is an organization, and I think it started about 6, 7 years ago. And because of this polarization that exists in our, especially during the election season, so they decided to find a way, they train people also to bring people together that might be on extremely opposite sides of their ideologies, partisan, and whether they are conservative or liberal, all kinds of differences. They're trying to bring people together to have a civil conversation. They don't have to agree, and they shouldn't come to change each other, but at least just to hear each other and try to understand. Then figure out for themselves, my goodness, we have something in common. Rather than telling them they have something in common, let them find out by hearing one another, but providing them the platform with some, rules for civil engagement so that they can talk to one another. That's pretty much what Braver Angels are about.
And Chris
But
just put their URL in the chat, braverangels.org. And now I'm going to solicit final thoughts from our panelists in reverse
thank you.
order. I'll invite Alana Hartsock, your final thoughts for the roundtable.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Of course, connection is so important. I'm going to connect. I think Wendell has dozed off. Wake up, Wendell, my friends. Wendell, he's out. Wendell is in Oregon.
Fitzy, wake up.
Chris is in Oregon. I want Chris and Wendell to connect in Oregon and to connect with Common Ground USA that has an active chapter working for land value tax in Oregon. So that's what it takes. It takes two or more gathered together, to get this thing rolling. That's all it takes. That's why having some little discussion, intentional, on March 19th or thereabouts for the Earth Day on Earth rights. Please, I appeal to you all. Can you do some small thing? Tell me what it is. I'll put it on the events list. You will be listed as one of the worldwide events. And from there, we'll keep building this.
Thank you, Alana. Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould.
Well, I think my focus is on the March 19th event. It is out of New York, but I think, as Alana has said, the attempt is to spread the word. The attempt is to try to get people to realize why it's so important that we are recognizing the celebration of this day and trying to make it far more public on March 19th, because the day was really Earth Day was taken off to April 22nd, and the important March 19th date, or the spring equinox date, was lost to the public. It's been kept alive by true believers, but we have to spread the word. So if we can we need to get you the information about what we've organized, and a lot of helpful information to get out into your list. That would be fantastic. And that should be on that.
Well, you know, I concur with everyone else's concerns. We clearly need to do something, and a lot of the well-meaning efforts I think that have been done over the years have been misconstrued, and people, you know, we're not used to having to do things ourselves, and that's a big problem. So I think that by our activity, and we all want to make this thing work, so you know, we're doing this together in order to try to get people just aware of the fact that you can make change, and God knows we need it.
You just stated what I'll say is the American distinction is that we used to be a nation that did things for ourselves, and that was driven by the pioneer experience, and we are far from that. But there was something about that that is imperative for a free people, illuminated by this anecdote. A German was interviewed, and after World War II, what was it like? How did the insanity of Nazism take over your country? Or what was life like in Nazi Germany before the war, but when you knew, like, you know, you're in the grips of an insanity? And this old fellow had the courage at a very old age to say, you know, I never tell anybody this, but you know, I'm old and I'll tell you this now. I thought it was the best years of my life. Okay. And the interviewer asked why. And the old guy said, because I didn't have to do any thinking. I didn't have to make any decisions.
Mm.
I just had to do what I was told. I was, you know, I was psychologically free as a bird.
I think I think a lot of people, even under the Nazi regime, felt that way in other countries.
Well, right. And we have to, that's such a generous warning that fellow gave us, because that is so tempting. And it's to rouse ourselves and say, no, I've got to do things for myself, especially think for myself, especially about the moral and ethical implications of what I allow by not protesting it.
Thank you, Bruce. And thank you all for your time and your talents. Okay. And thank you, Alana. You know, I'm going to do something this March 19th. I've got a platter, so I just add another thing to my platter. But again, it's people, it's government by, for, and by the people. By the people means that we have to participate, not just do nothing. Okay, so onwards to a better future.
Yes.
Thank
Chris.
you.
Thank you.
Amen.
Chris.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Bruce.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.